Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Be sure to join our network and get involved in the work that we are doing. If you can, please like and subscribe. It helps us build this channel, which serves as a platform to communicate with our members. This video is part of our 2025 annual conference. We're looking for folks to be on the conference planning committee. Please email info@housingoregon.org.
First of all, everybody give yourselves a big clap. We're like at the end of the day. Nobody falling asleep today. My name is Christy Willard, and I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Authority of Malheur in Harney County, and I have had the privilege to moderate today's session, which is ORCA's Future Development Resources and Adaptive Solutions for the year 2025 through 27. So just a little bit of a background. The Oregon Centralized ORCA was created. Every single time I say ORCA, I'm thinking of the biggest orca, in the water. Was created to streamline state investments in affordable rental housing by using one application process for all types of projects and funding requests, reducing administrative burden for developers, and providing meaningful feedback earlier in the development process. This forward-looking panel discussion will focus on development resources and funding opportunities available during the 2025 through 2027 biennium, alongside ongoing updates to ORCA based on industry feedback and evolving housing needs. Attendees, you guys will leave today with a better, clear understanding of available resources, the role and management of the waiting list pipeline, and how feedback directly influences the state's approach to affordable housing development. So we have no slides today. This is kind of going to be a one-on-one. We're going to just kumbaya together and ask all the questions we need to do, okay? So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have Natasha Detweiler-Daby, who is the Director of Affordable Rental Housing, right here in the center. And we have Roberto Franco, Deputy Director of Development for OHCS. And we have Mitch Hanush, who is the Senior Operations and Policy Analyst for OHCS as well. So, getting started, I get to grill you all with some questions today. So this is going to be for Natasha and Mitch. How does the ORCA accelerate housing production?
Okay, so let's see, is the microphone working okay? Okay, great. So nice to be with you all here today. I think, I think I'll share over to Mitch in a second, but I think overall, if we think about the systems that we have had in place over the years and where we were coming from a place of having multiple, definitely more than 5, sometimes more than 10 different fund offerings in any one year. And so for an individual project to find the resource match that would work for their projects, there was significant time both for, once we got legislative investment, being able to create and curate the policy that we were wanting to further in a specific fund offering. And then also, a lot of investment in the competition, and felt like we were spending our time, effort, and energy collectively either applying for or competing out for resources. And generally, the projects that we were seeing come through are amazing. They are responsive to community. They are doing all of the core work that is needed to be impactful and responsive to the critical housing needs. And that time lag was really putting a lot of stress on readiness in terms of you didn't really know, had no predictability about when that next fund offering, if you weren't successful, when would that next fund offering happen more into the future? And so I think functionally what the ORCA is allowing us to do as we are investing in our core needs to innovate, to expedite production, and really think about doing that work differently. Having a centralized place for all resources can be offered, but also find the best fit for them. And so as a centralized process, no matter what you are seeking financing for, there's a single point of entry through the intake process. It is routed to the appropriate and responsive criteria and elements to evaluate it. And we've really, through this, built essentially a pipeline. It is a managed pipeline, the pipeline wait list. And so as we are getting investments, we are able to very nimbly turn back over to be able to finance new investments and put legislative investments to action. And I think that has had kind of rebounding, and I think that we are continuing to see those impacts, but we are absolutely finding that we're having swifter ability to do that and also hold clearer lines of performance to getting that housing built and constructed and into community.
Yeah, I think all of that. Also, I'm Mitch Hanush. I know we got the intro, but nice to see everyone. Thank you for coming to the last Housing Oregon After Dark session here. And it feels very much, acoustic without the PowerPoint, so bear with us. I do have some numbers from our first year. So as Natasha said, it was a lot about efficiency, right? Like, we get all these resources from the legislature, and we were focusing a lot on each individual program and how we were going to deliver those to community and what projects we wanted to see come from those resources. And the flavor of money that we were getting every biennium was getting rapidly expanded, and trying to find a way to make all of those resources come together to fund more projects in a more efficient manner, both for you and for us. And that was really the driving force behind the ORCA concept. And in year one, so while we were still sort of figuring out a lot, as a lot of you know, and have bared with us, we were able to fund 17% more projects in 15% fewer days. We delivered more funding and more units statewide at a faster pace than we have ever done. We committed over 100% of the funds that we did in the previous year in half the time. And we increased the percent of funding sent to rural Oregon too, by 9 percentage points. So some of our key pieces of this, yeah, really great stuff. And it's not perfect. We're still working on improving a lot of things, but I think it was a big swing, and a lot of you, were a real big part of us developing this process and trying to get it to this point. And I think, as Natasha mentioned, now we have sort of an established pipeline. We're getting resources from the legislature this last biennium, and we've been able to award them to projects almost immediately, which is amazing. We were able to award projects slightly over a month after we got it from the legislature, which is unprecedented. And we're really excited by kind of the goals that we're meeting. There's obviously, again, still work that we're doing, still evaluation that we're doing, still conversations we're having with all of you to sort of increase some of the things that we want to increase, try to hit the targets that we're trying to hit. But yeah, I think in terms of housing production, acceleration, really we wanted to get out of the way as much as possible. And I think we've felt like we've moved in that direction to the degree that we can, at least at the moment, and we'll continue to try to do better at that. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Natasha and Mitch, for that. What is the waitlist pipeline, and how does the process work for matching resources to projects?
Great. This is the most exciting question for those on waitlist. I think, part of, as we have launched the ORCA and continued to invest in evolving it, where we are understanding or experiencing ourselves the experiences of, there's things that needed to be further defined or further built out, and as we're seeing those impacts. And I think, with that very intentional focus on continued learning, evaluation, and responsible change, we are continuing to make those refinements. And I think one of the things, since we hadn't, in our prior structure, we did a NOFA, we did a competitive offering, and you either got funded or you didn't, and you went back to waiting for the next fund offering to come through. We didn't continue to use your application materials. That was all, a unique experience. And so we had not, at the time of the ORCA launching, we had never had a list. We had never maintained a pipeline. So that idea of, a prospective pipeline where we would know it And we were able to do that in the ORCA because we've evaluated against standards that we have said apply across it all. So again, we know all of your projects that we were evaluating and scoring, you know, again, with a very, very rare exception, those are all been amazing to look at and evaluate and are, you know, pretty challenging to score and realize, oh, can't get that one funded. And these are our internal team dynamics. But you know, so we've evaluated projects, they meet our standard, and so they are on the wait list. And so when we are getting legislative investment or other resources become freed up or can do it, you know, I'm thinking of that like a waterfall. So we have the resources eligible for, you know, so is it a lift project? Is it creating net new units? Is it a preservation project? Is it eligible for PSH funds? Is it eligible for home funds? And so effectively we take those resources and we waterfall it down that list. And it'll stick to the project that it can fit with. And in this last update, we have worked to provide stronger ways for external clarity on that instead of having just, so we have the wait list with one set of numbers down, one to, you know, however many is on in that month. But then we've also identified, added other columns of information where we pulled out, okay, this is the metro region. Okay, this is the rural ones. And so you can have an easier way to look down and say, oh, if there's money in rural, I'm the top on the rural, or I'm in, you know, the suburbs and I'm the top on that list. And so those are trying to have some of that external clarity. I think have heard lots of questions and curiosity, and then it feels like, you know, kind of challenging. And I will say it is challenging to look through, you know, work through that wait list. I think, you know, Roberto and I are constantly in that place of navigation. And so really trying to figure out how we are better communicators about that. And so I think we have invested in some of those external flags around that. We're trying to add more narrative descriptions to each project status to have that fit. But really it is looking at the list, what are the resources that we have? So is there an investment for veterans in rural communities that we are able to invest? Then we can look down and find the first project on that list, the top project that is doing that and is meeting that, and then we would be really swiftly being able to turn that over into applications. Let's see, other thoughts to add to that fun process?
Fun process, yeah. No, I was just going to add that I think inherent in the waitlist concept, it's also what we've been saying for the last couple of years when we're working, setting up the ORCA, is the readiness to proceed, the being ready. So you only get on the wait list as the application is completely reviewed and is ready. And that is playing out really well, and we saw it the last couple of months now. When a project is truly ready, when we take it to Housing Council for a recommendation and a reservation of funding, that then it accelerates the rest of the process that needs to happen. So when we talk, and we've been talking before about readiness to proceed, which it varies and it may apply to differently to different projects, but that's really inherent in that waitlist project. So what I would say, keep working on your project. I think we're only subject to the availability of funding, because if we had plenty, we would have gone through that list as projects were ready to move forward.
I think I just add one other piece to that, because I think that's, in that evolution of our understanding about how we need to provide clarity around our wait list, I think that's another piece that we have now, having gone through the year of it, know that as we are getting to that place, and so as we were getting to the place where legislative investment was coming, we did the work to, the royal you all did the work to make sure for us that you're still in the same status of readiness, that you are still, that the resources that you had initially proposed to us when you had submitted that initially to get on that list were still true in terms of the needs, and your timeliness was still going to be within it. And I think that is, just huge appreciation for the lift that is. And I think it is what allowed us to have confidence saying we can turn this really quickly, because that, that wait list is validated. It is still fresh information. And I think as we, we've done that now, we've recognized that. So that'll be part of what we, started to kind of habitually incorporate as we are finding these moments. Again, with an absolute appreciation for not wanting you to have to update it every 5 minutes if there's no point for it. And so I think there's, that balance that we want to make sure that we have a real and active wait list of real projects that can work, but also putting that reasonability and trying to, place that, you do prioritize that burden when there's the potential for real impact.
Great, thank you. So this is for Roberto and Mitch, and I might take a minute or so to say some stuff. We'll see how it goes. How does the recent update address rural housing needs and culturally specific developers?
Yeah, so we, as a lot of you probably know, just updated the ORCA a couple months ago and made a few kind of key shifts to it in the kind of vision of constant improvement. And one of the ones that we're really proud of, I think, is our update to sort of our set-asides, and particularly looking at the way that we're defining rural and the way that we have changed the rural set-aside definition. Our initial year of metrics, when we were doing our evaluation, we have kind of our key things that we're looking at, and one of those is amount of funding that's going to rural communities. We saw that 32% of our funding went to rural communities as we had defined it, which in our vision was a huge success. It was about 10% over, it was 9% over what we had had in previous years, and was generally the direction that we were trying to go. We then, though, took that next step of kind of gut checking those numbers with folks in rural communities, which I don't know that we've always done in the past. We get our metrics and we see success and we count that as a win and we keep moving, and we don't take that time to really validate. And I think we had some really great conversations with some of the folks in the room here around sort of whether that was the reality that they were seeing on the ground, whether they were seeing more funding come to their rural communities. And I think the resounding answer was no, that they were seeing it go to larger communities that were in those potentially rural categories, but it wasn't actually going to the places that they would on the ground see as rural. And so working with our research team, who was great, and with partners who had given us that feedback, we were able to sort of update and add nuance to our definitions, add a whole new category of small city and suburban, and sort of check that new definition against sort of the funding that we had provided in that first year, and see that with the new definition, about 2% of our funding had gone to what we were now defining as rural, which much more supported the position that a lot of our partners had seen on the ground, and I think was able to add a little bit of nuance to the way that we were looking at it. And before we were distributing these new dollars that we got in this most recent legislative session, we were able to update our set-asides to reflect that new definition, and projects that, as Natasha mentioned, were further down potentially on the overall wait list and would not have received funding if in the old kind of paradigm, were able to be funded immediately based on the new definition in truly rural communities as we saw it. And we'll continue to have those conversations and make sure that we're sort of reflecting what you all are seeing on the ground. But I think I'm really proud of our sort of follow-up with you all and continued effort to continue engaging and checking our assumptions and making changes based on those checks of our assumptions. And yeah, I think we also, in addition to that, we took rural, so initially in year one, rural, nonprofit rural, and culturally specific organizations were part of the same set-aside. And something we heard from culturally specific partners was that they felt more of those resources were potentially being taken by the nonprofit rural communities, and that there was potentially some overlap that was happening, and it didn't reflect necessarily the same priority that they felt should be being met. So by adding that nuance to the rural definition, we were able to give it its own set-aside, which then allowed us to give CSOs their own set-aside as well, which I think will allow us to target resources more effectively directly to those organizations, as opposed to this sort of clustering that we had done in the past year.
Do you want to go first, Christy? Okay. All right. This is probably more kind of a reflection about, these concepts of rural, but also culturally specific organizations. And I say this because I think over the years, we've been evolving as circumstances change. And sometimes fair enough that somebody says, why do you keep changing the definition? I was working under this concept. Now you're changing it on me. Sometimes that happens, and I'll recognize that. But it's also, in my mind, in our minds, is that we also have to adapt. We live in a political, in a social, and other political environments that requires us to adjust. And this is probably, I'm going to date myself here, but back in the 1990s, yeah. Yeah, that's dating myself. Anyway, but back in the 1990s, we had what we call the consolidated funding cycle, the famous CFCs, or for some.
Who did the CFC? Anybody?
Oh yeah, there you go. Or the infamous CFCs. We didn't go too far in the naming. but my point of referencing that is that even then we had the priorities for rural communities. We probably didn't have a definition, or maybe we did, but where I'm going with this is that working with rural communities, working with cultural specific organizations or BIPOC communities now has been part of the trajectory and the work of OHCS and the state for that matter. So back in those days, we only had very limited funding. It was either tax credits or home and what is called now HDGP, what used to be called the Housing Trust Fund. So the agency had to do this way of scoring the CFC to see how much go into rural and how much urban and under the line, about the line. There were not a lot of funding to really do set-asides like we have the ability to do now. Most of the funding for culturally specific populations or groups, if I can remember, was around farm workers. That was one of the largest groups. It was also that time that the state and the support of foundations that the CDCs were created, a lot of them working with specific communities. So I can think of Hacienda CDC working with Latinos and immigrants. I can think of Bienestar in Hillsborough, Saving CDC, PCRI, FHDC in Woodburn. That was part of the push in creating, if you will, the specific organizations working with specific populations. And it was still really trying to compete with the limited funding we have. At that time also we had the farm worker housing tax credits that I believe that was really intended to reach a certain population, the farm workers, that we continue to have. And so part of this, and then we have the NOFAs in the, I think I was gone those years, but anyway, then the NOFAs came, and we continue with that, if you will, strategy and commitment in working with cultural specific organizations as well as rural communities. And now we are at the ORCA. Now we utilize in different type of data. And I think our commitment is there, meaning we have to set aside for rural communities, we have to set aside for cultural specific organizations, because we as an agency is still committed to doing equity and racial justice work. So I think that that will stay with us, and I think what I'm saying is we may keep evolving because we have to adapt to it. So a long time ago, I think the name was Communities of Color. Now it's BIPOC. I don't know what's next, but right now we're using culture-specific organizations and using certain definitions that meet the current circumstances where we are. So I think we're asking also our partner developers to work with us in that flexibility, because to make it work within the funding requirements and framework that we have, we also have to adapt to those circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that what I could address as far as being in a rural, and I'm in an extremely rural county. I'm from Ontario, Oregon, so I'm really far away from here. Is the fact that things have really evolved with the new ORCA process. I've been at my agency for a little over 13 years now, so we were part of the NOFA process. And with the NOFA process, I believe that a lot of, and even some of my fellow colleagues might be able to agree with us on this, that with the NOFA process, although it was good, however, it really discouraged us at some point in time being a rural developer because of the fact that we didn't have enough resources, we didn't have enough capital stack, we didn't know where we fit in, we didn't know how the point system worked. There was just a lot of unknowns to this process. With the new ORCA process, it has evolved and it has helped us to deploy resources out to our rural communities. We had not developed a housing project in over 25 years. So since 1997 was when Eastern Oregon had their last affordable housing project. Then Northwest Housing Alternatives came in. They built a project, which was fantastic. And now Northwest Housing Alternatives, as a development consultant with us, we are now going to build another 30 units for those folks that are experiencing homelessness. And this is all thanks to just the set-asides that have been put out for us, and OHCS recognizing that it really does take a village to address the needs of a rural community. Even capacity building funds. I had never knew that we would qualify for capacity building funds. It's been 30 plus years that we never even got any capacity building funds. And just within this year, we were able to apply for the ORCA capacity building funds, and then also for the GHAP capacity building funds, in which we were awarded both. That has helped us tremendously as far as personnel goes, development work, architectural work, any type of pre-development costs that we may need. And so I just really have to commend OHCS on how much they have seen us and heard us, how the TA has kicked in and they have been there to assist us. If we have questions, it's a easy email to, the TA providers, and they get our questions answered. And I like the fact that we're not put on the bottom of the list, or that our application is just kicked out. It's still there and it's still within that pipeline. And I think that that really does put a lot of us rural community developers' minds at ease that eventually it's going to happen. We're working on it. It might take us a little bit more time, but eventually we do know that we are creating a pipeline to develop more affordable housing in our areas. All right. Natasha, what is the status of legislative investments for the 2025-2027 biennium?
Great. So this is the most exciting question, and I think I will also just want to highlight our technical advisors. I think part of our whole, and also to credit the state legislature for investing in OHCS to be able to do this work. I think, and all of everybody who worked on both giving input and building out the ORCA. But I think some of these revisions were really about what are bodies of work that we really needed to have active energy, attention, and care for. And I think the technical advisors, for those of you who were in the time of the CFC, we had RADs at the time, and so felt like without that presence, being able to have somebody who is a phone call away to be able to talk about your project, and I think just so much appreciation and care for those relationships, the ties to capacity building, where we knew where we were seeing in probably in those initial the home ARP offerings, where we paired those together, where you are investing in the community, you're able to support their capacity to be able to bring the projects forward. And I think if you're really listening to communities without housing going on, the barrier so often is just capacity to get it figured out and to get all of that. I know the lift of development, as I watch everybody doing it, is so intricate, careful, and you need to have that persistence. And to do that, you need to have capacity to do it. You need to have something to give to support that. And I think the advisor's doing that. So to the question of the resources, this is, so we are now in September. We had our legislative investment end of June, early July. And we have, at this point, done that waterfall down our wait list, and we have fully subscribed all of our new lift investments that were allocated out to regions. And so That is, I think, a huge moment to celebrate, and it also is, I completely understand, baffling to understand. It is the place of, our adaptation to our process and the idea of, oh, okay, now we are out of those resources until there is additional legislative investment. And I think with sincerity, that is that will start to feel simpler over time as we have, get into the cadence of what the ORCA is and what this waitlist pipeline is. And though those regional resources are, fully expended, there are other resources. We do have permanent supportive housing funds for those that are investing in those projects. Very excited. We have new legislative investment in senior resources to be able to support housing development for aging, older adults and disabled households. We have resources held for a modular set aside that was tied to the legislature, and so there'll be some group process work that is going to be giving us some recommendations about how we should prioritize those resources, and those are to be used for affordable home ownership or affordable rental. And so I think that we see a lot that is coming down the pike that will allow us, while we have, again, spent the majority of our LIFT funds for this biennia, there are other pieces of work that will continue to move forward. And again, as those resources are offered, we'll identify how they work, and then we will waterfall those down and use all opportunities to find the place where they fit. We do still have resources remaining in our culturally specific organization set aside. And I think just, to the impact of our set asides, I think they're important because they are needed. And so they are important because, if not for that rural update to the definition in that, we would have not gotten to those 3 really rural projects that we were able to fund in the first month after legislative investment. And without that culturally specific organization set aside remaining that, those would have been, quickly subsumed by others that had been able to act faster or had that project in that other place of readiness. And we know very well that there's projects that are in development that are going to use those resources. And so it's not for lack of action and taking steps forward. It is a timing, and some things just take a minute longer when you are a culturally specific organization who is trying to foster and expand housing in light of this political environment, in light of the workload on their desks, which is unique and different. And I think it is so important that we're being responsive and that we use those. It's a policy intricacy of a set aside, but they matter because they have impact, and we are seeing that actively. And so I think at this point there's so there's some pieces of resources that we have. We also do have the updates to federal resources. I think of the we have our 9% resources. Those will also, we had just had one funding round this year. We'll have another resource offering opening early next year for 9% tax credits. That one does require some selection processes by the IRS, so that has a kind of a selection process as it is entering the ORCA, and so you're selected and then you move forward assuming those resources. And we also have private activity bonds and 4% tax credits, and so again, where the market conditions can support all those different aspects, really wanting to make sure that we are supporting those innovative concepts as much as possible with the resources we have. We have Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credits and kind of all of the standard programs. It's the and we know that we are subsidy constrained, and at this point it is the subsidy constraint that is preventing us from continuing to fund down that list, because that would be the dream, is to get it all out of the list and onto desks and into community.
Great, thank you. And that kind of leads us into the next question for you, Roberto and Natasha. How is OHCS preparing for and adapting to changes at the federal level? So I know, Natasha, you just spoke a little bit on it, but if you want to expand a little bit more on that, that'd be great.
Yes, I think I think that is there's a lot that you could put underneath that umbrella of how are we responding to federal changes. I think in all ways and shapes, paying attention, being intentional, and also focusing on the work that we are able to move forward and build, um, you know. Uh, More support for more housing because that is what we terrifically need in the state. And so I think, so certainly 9% tax credit, it increased our 9% allocation by 12%. We were able to fund another project that we probably wouldn't have been able to, and we just, as soon as that was announced, we did it. From that, because that 9% process, so it wasn't a random one, it was the next one on the list that would have gotten funded. And then we have the update to the 4% tax credit, and for those of you who are private activity bond wonks, this is old news, but for those that are not, the previously, in order to generate a 4% tax credit, which gives you tax credit equity to invest into your project, you needed to have financed it with at least 50%, or 50% of the cost needed to be financed with private activity bond authority. Each state gets a specific amount based on population calculation of private activity bonds annually to be able to spend. Oregon has embraced housing for private activity bond. I think not to be taken for granted that Oregon has dedicated the lion's share, nearly all of it, to support housing production. And that would really, I think we had and there was definitely a lot of the last few years spent with a real constraint in private activity bonds with both state resources and metro bond funds leveraging that. And so both thankfully we are over that bubble, so there's no longer the explicit part of the conversation where it says, well, we can't let you close this year, we have to wait till another year. But that, instead of now 50%, it's now 25%. So effectively, for half of the investment in private activity bonds, you generate the same amount of federal tax credit. And so that is then that federal policy change. Each state is working on different implementation strategies. I think we are soon to be issuing the formalized document that is our approach, but really wanting to ensure that we are continuing to foster and expand production. And so we'll, where our prior limit had been, that project had to request 55%, so a little bit of buffer in case of increased costs in the future. We would now allow projects from, to 30%, minimum 30% of private activity bonds in your project financing stack. And if you needed additional resources to continue to support your project, so you could go up to 55%. So keeping that as still the range of it, I think generally wanting to make sure that we're getting the most reach for our private activity bonds, but also our subsidy side. So not wanting to make a reduction in private activity bonds if that means that there is a place that would increase subsidy needs. If those private activity bonds are critical to be able to finance construction, want to make sure that we're responsive on that as well. And I guess I missed the other logic point, which is private activity bonds is tax exempt, and so the interest rate is usually better than a regular interest rate that you would get without that funding source. And then I think, in all of the places of other adaptations, I think as Roberto was speaking to, making sure that we are continuing to evolve, that we are keeping our values at the core, where our housing needs to be responsive to need, it needs to be responsive to communities, and that is, and so maybe some of the terminology or the shifts over time, but we are, confident and sure in our direction. We have incorporated and continue to direct resources and engagement and intention with culturally specific organizations. We are wanting and expecting that our projects are incorporating active efforts to ensure that you are reaching those communities that are in need of housing, that you are providing access and opportunity that is real and is not symbolic, and that you're doing that work to really make sure that you are building inclusive communities where people of all kinds are finding homes. Maybe, I don't know, Roberto, any other insight?
Can always add something. No, I think that there are other national trends that we're also keeping an eye on. So I'm talking, there's a lot of federal policies that have passed that have impact on the market. So if we're not getting now 85 cents to a dollar for tax credits, I think coming down to 75. So it's not new, meaning that that's happened before. So for us, it's always how do we, well, there's not a lot we can do, meaning as a state, to change that, but how do we adapt to it? So in many cases, I think what we need, what we're telling developers or coming in, back to that readiness to proceed. Make sure that the pricing that you had, let's say 2 months ago, 3 months ago, is still the same that you're getting. Because if that changes, that will create a funding gap for the project. And sometimes there's very little that we can do to fill the gap there. And so we're keeping an eye on it because we know it's real and it could stall a project for several months. So I think that's the only other piece that it's a market that we cannot control, but it's, I mean, again, the effects and impacts of federal policy that, yeah, we just have to adapt to and find ways, making sure that the projects are still viable. And if not, which sometimes we have those conversations, then can we look at a different time when that project is really ready?
Great. Thank you both. Thank you all for doing this, but now you're going to be put in a hot seat. So now we're going to take questions from the audience. So we do have a few minutes. If anybody's got some questions, please raise your hand, and I will have Kim run around and be the mic person.
All right. Hello. Okay.
Hopefully this is a quick question. Lift for home ownership, is that going to start going through ORCA in the next offering, upcoming offering, whatever that's being called now?
Yeah, so the Lyft homeownership is through the homeownership division, and so they are not using the ORCA, at least at this point, but they have adapted their NOFA offerings to really function far more as an open application period with a review process and ability to move forward with much less focus on that competition piece. And so I think, from a different vantage point of we have lots of different columns of different flavors of resources. So there's lesser in home ownership. And so I think that is at this point addressing the need, but I think continue to see how it goes. But I think their adaption of their NOFA process is done a really effective job at really kind of giving that place of, okay, you got it, you can come in, and yeah, absolutely.
Questions? Okay.
I guess while Kim is gathering that question, I'll also say, looking forward, I think the modular set aside that I spoke about, again, could be Lyft homeownership or rental. And I think that we will end up, conceptually, I think that could be one selection process for the two, but, conceptually, once it's selected, it would go, onto the rental side through ORCA or to home ownership. But I think that will be another opportunity as well that we're excited to get figured out.
So thank you all so much for the presentation. I am recasting a question that came up in one of the preservation groups yesterday, which is we are seeing lots of struggles for existing projects around operational costs for a variety of reasons. And the question is really, how are we incorporating those lessons in underwriting projects?
That was a great question. I think, I know earlier today, Kelso did her session for anybody who attended on the financial reporting analysis for those operational constraints. And I think, that is a significant and active concern and place of investing our own attention and legislative investment to support those operations. I think we are trying to, kind of take a beat around where is it that we need to be requiring something fundamentally different within our underwriting guidelines, but also needing to invest in, to make sure that, our underwriting guidelines are kind of the base of expectations, and we are explicit around our ability to be responsive. So I think, like Roberto was saying, where you are wanting to make sure you are, like, we're wanting everybody and encouraging, supporting, requiring those factors to be really truth tested. So where you are seeing that your increases or your costs are different, I think this is effectively, as we have talked to other state housing finance agencies across the country, I think similarly are finding that this is just a lot of volatility. And so it is that volatility is the largest reason for our operating challenges, but also it is hard to pin down what is the right dollar. And so really instead want everybody to be looking at your own projects, operational costs, what are you seeing, and actually not just base it on your rule of thumb that we learned 5 years ago or a decade ago, or the project that you built 5 years ago, but look at the project that they are operating today and incorporate those in. And then we're, right there with you in terms of believing and understanding that. Again, we have some back-end analyses that we look at as kind of reasonability tests for managing and ensuring consistency across our production pipeline. And I think so we'll be using all of those, but I think it is a real impact. It's still one that doesn't feel like it's fully sat down yet. I do think as we look at and approach funding gaps and other strategies, whereas, 3, 4, 5 years ago, we would have been more comfortable stripping through reserves or other contingencies or lessening budgets for those aspects. I think are wanting and are really focusing on not doing that, because I think we have seen and understand where you are going into even development, or when you're getting into trying to do stabilization and you don't have those places to rely on amidst all of this volatility that we have, right on our laps concern. And so really wanting to make sure that you're building those healthily and are getting significantly resourced to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think it's that, and also it's probably for us and for developers to also think about the financial assumptions that we make when we create and develop the pro forma. There is no, unfortunately, a crystal ball that can tell us what the market is going to look like after I'm finished and doing it. So part of this is really making sure that the units that we select, that is selected, or the population that is selected, that there is really the ability of the market to support that. Because again, I think we probably need to start looking at how close to truth the financial assumptions we can get there. The other piece to this that, again, it's not in our control, it's also the ability for tenants and families to pay the rent. That is also a factor in there, because many of the properties that may be struggling financially is because tenants may not be able to pay the rent, so they're behind. So you can't operate when you've got major rent losses. So there's not a lot that we can do there, but I think looking at the pro formas and the financial assumptions is probably one of the other pieces that we need to look at.
Yeah, and just off of that, I mean, Kelso presented earlier. She's our financial strategy analyst, and as Natasha mentioned, we do have kind of better numbers on operating expenses than we've had in a very long time, or maybe ever, and are very aware of the conversations around these kind of assumptions, specifically the 2% and 3% and the 7% vacancy rate. We are also, the stewards of public resources that need to be considering the 30-year time horizon that we're looking at these projects through. And when we look backwards 30 years, the averages do shake out to about 3% and 2%. We also understand that that's not the reality people are seeing on the ground, and that they haven't seen on the ground in the last several years. Wanting to be able to balance those two things of not making a knee-jerk reaction and suddenly, underwriting to 5 and 10%, but also trying to make sure that when we're looking at your project, we're seeing the realistic next several years before we maybe look at more of an average over the future 30-year time horizon. I think is a conversation we're currently having. Really excited to have better data on kind of what these last several years have been so that we can potentially utilize that for a more nuanced look at this kind of short-term time horizon, but also keeping in mind that long-term time horizon for the health of these projects moving forward.
I might just add, and I see another hand back there, Kim, but I add one other thing, which I think is that this is just, yeah, we'll just go for it. But we haven't really talked. I mean, anyway, we've talked. We experience this readily often. So I think there are a lot of areas of concern and challenges when projects are getting developed, when they are operating, and some of them are kind of solvable, including where you have an insufficient market and you have vacant units. So when you are sitting on units and you have 10, 20, 30% vacant, maybe we missed the market. And maybe that is a place where we collectively need to pay more attention on that side, where we see rents flattening, where we see market rents much closer to affordable, or where you're designing a 60% project that are, you know, tiny bedrooms and who, you know, in a, you know, that who, you know, really wanting to make sure that you have really built your project concept out so that you know that you'll have folks in those units when you are ready, when you got that C of O and you can put units into action, because there are numerous projects both in our portfolio but also in you know, in that place of you know, conversion that we have, you know, are engaged in, have engaged in over the last several years, and I think, you know, again, always wanting to practice the responsive in the moment and make sure that those are units that can continue to move forward. But I think those are pieces that, you know, we can, I think, learn that lesson and have that play impact now in terms of really getting the confidence that the market is there, really looking at what market rents are, looking at what those comps are to make sure that your referral pathways are solid and they will be able to occupy the projects swiftly. And I think in the scheme of all of the challenges, some of those are solvable. Some of those are, well, you know, updating your assumptions or making sure you get those gaps when we're approaching construction and, oh, well, I didn't realize it would be, you know, that much for the, you know, electric grid thing, you know, whatever it might be that comes up. But I think there are also all of these like project concept design and strategy where it is really incumbent on us to make sure that it is, you know, responsive to the market as well as the need.
That was a long response. Okay, for people who have questions, I'm going to go to Jill, then I'm going to go to Sheila and go up front, and then I'm going to come to Stephanie, and then I'll go to you, Travis. So that's the order. Lots of questions.
And thank you all so much for having this session. Because we have limited gap resources, because of the limited gap resources, all of us, especially the public funders and the public like housing authorities, we, at least for me, I feel like we're incumbent on making sure we have that fiduciary responsibility to the public. Is it possible for OHCS, because you fund so many projects across the state, to do something similar to what was done on the portfolio, but do it on the capital side, to help us understand the cost and what is reasonable cost and what are the most effective forms of construction and development? Because at least in the metro region, we're looking at units that's easily 500,000 plus, and even north of 750,000 a unit, and that seems to me really high. So looking at this, thinking, how can we collectively be better stewards and see what can we do to lower that cost per unit, reduce that public subsidy, and optimize across the board. Just hoping you guys would be able to do something similar to the portfolio.
Mitch is too excited to answer it.
Mostly, so we had the great timing of doing a really extensive cost study in 2019, which immediately became irrelevant and silly. And so we have all of this great data from before the pandemic, and it's all shifted dramatically. And we are actively working on ways that we can take sort of the same modeling that we did prior to 2020 and adapt some of the more active current cost data into that, knowing that some of the national databases that we're looking at aren't very reflective of the local realities, knowing that even regional within the state look fundamentally different in the current landscape, and it's a big project. So some of this is related to the work that we're doing kind of internal on our own data systems to try to get better reporting and get cleaner numbers and do better report outs, but we are actively thinking about it. And yeah, I think also, looking at sort of some of the new strategies out there, and some of the new legislative initiatives, modular being a big one of those, trying to, do better analysis of these different types of housing and understand better what the delta is there between regular, typical 60% LIHTC project and, maybe one of these new modular builds, or potentially, and, keeping PSH in mind and all of these other types of projects that we're seeing out there right now, so that we can better understand what types of projects cost what parts of the state generally cost what, and things along those lines. But that is, it's a large body of work, but it is ongoing, and it is something that we're very interested in kind of pursuing and continuing. But yeah, it was really bad timing, unfortunately, with the last big one that we did.
It's still there though, right?
It is still there. If you're interested in historic.
A tale of times past. Does anybody remember tax credit pricing of like $1 or more? That was, yeah.
First of all, I just want to thank OHCS for the hard work that you've done. I mean, to hear the extra 3 rural projects that were funded, I mean, I'm over here almost tearing, so I just think that was really great. More of a rudimentary question, frankly. When we're talking about the wait list, and we're getting to the space where funding is beginning to run dry, obviously we have our vantage point of how much effort and work and expense we put into the projects to be ready to proceed. But while we're in the space of readiness that we don't know if it's a couple months to 2 years, right? The question on our end, especially in the more rural areas when funding is a little bit more restricted, how much effort do we put into that readiness to proceed? And at one point, do we say, okay, pencils down? I mean, do you guys have something on your side that you see that we should be aware of?
I think this is this is largely a challenge because the vast majority of our resources are legislatively allocated, and so they are in that way amazing and a little bit, and very unpredictable, and so I think from a place right now, we know that we have fully subscribed these regional resources, and we need to see what the legislature chooses to invest in the future. And so that could be something in short session and, early next year, or it could be the year after that. There could be other things that happen that free it up. And so I think that there is, I guess, certainly always interested, willing, and able to talk with you. I think look at the technical advisors. I see Kate back there, wanting to jump in and help answer. But yeah. So yes, I think it is. So I think it's, let's talk. I think again, like our actions and our structure is aiming and prioritizing being collaborative partners with you in all of the ways that we can, and still having an accountability arm, but really wanting to be collaborative. And then also just thinking about, flexibility for, are there other financing structures? Are there, there were some projects that as we were able to offer private activity bonds, that we're able to convert those to be able to be 4% projects instead. And so kind of finding those angles in those places. The other thing I'm optimistic for is the continued impact of our pre-development resources. I think we're pretty subscribed at the moment for the broad pre-development, but as those resources are repaid, we would be recycling those, and then, as a means for giving additional resources to support that readiness so that can move forward. And so there's a bit of a calculus there in terms of where is it, and kind of how do we see the likelihood? Are you on that list and you're doing senior housing, and we know we have senior resources, we'll be working to prioritize. And so I think that, all are, opportunities to come, but there's, it really is an imperfect answer, and it's because we are reliant on those legislative allocations versus having an ongoing commitment of X million a year or biennia, to be able to program that forward. Because I think if we had greater predictability about that, I think we could give higher confidence and certainty on timing.
I do think and you mentioned this earlier, but we are trying to be as transparent as possible about where your project might be positioned on that wait list, and your region, and potentially what other resources your project could be eligible for, whether it's a PSH deal or a senior housing deal or something along those lines. And we are actively working on other strategies to find other resources out there that we have available to us, like 501c3 bonds, or some things around E&D bonds, things along those lines that we know are going to be valuable, especially as we become really gap resource constrained.
Thanks again for all your hard work. Let's see, questions about the 9% tax credit and opportunities there, as well as a separate question about the Oregon tax credit, and is that something that ever is going to be maybe available?
Sure. So I'll just do highlights on the highlight reel. So 9% tax credits. It is those are offered annually. So in early 2020, we're in 25, right? So 26, early 2026. My mind is already in 27. We'll be offering another round of those resources, and to a large extent that has, we have adapted that 9% selection process into a standards-based review, with then, some tiebreakers to highlight those. And so it's really policy enriched that are the top tiebreakers in terms of, it's prioritized the PSH, co-located, early learning, and universal design, and then also does have, of the total resources of 9% tax credits, 25% for preservation projects and 10% for tribal projects. And so I think those are those opportunities. We do, this year, we for the first time offered more meaningful or more substantial gap resources with the 9% tax credits, largely responsive to all of these things that we've been talking about, the rising costs, the lowered pricing, and the desire to make sure we're funding as many projects with as many units as we can. So there's we've allowed $3 million in lift resources, and then we have also allowed the paired subsidy for PSH, and as well as same for preservation. And so I think all of those resources will be offered. In terms of the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit, those are, that is a resource that is alive, active. It is a lender tax credit, and so it gives your bank a tax credit in exchange for an interest rate reduction. And so I think, and there's intricacies below that in a general development new project, where you're using OHTC, the financial benefit of that interest rate reduction is passed through to tenants by way of rent reductions. There are some exceptions to that, including for preservation. And then this new in this legislative session, it was also updated for that OHTC to exempt pass-through, so you get that interest rate reduction without needing to pass through the financial benefit. So that's a real financial impact. And we'll be able to exempt that pass-through on projects that are financially distressed. So as we look at our project portfolio and operations, the intent as we have worked and engaged with lenders on portfolio projects is to be able to, as we have, modest investment of subsidy to help buy down debt, but also be able to layer in that OHTC on top of that to recast those loans and hopefully fix the financial operational challenges for as many projects as we'll be able to, and that'll all also be moving through ORCA.
All right, I'm going to go to Stephanie and then Travis.
Thank you, guys. In the future of the ORCA process, do you see the realm of possibility where the qualifications aren't just based on readiness, but on what populations there are gaps, or the efficiency of the price per unit, and other factors than just being ready?
I think as all things, I've worked at OHCS for nearly 20 years. All things cycle around. And so I will say probably at some point that will. I think at this point, though, I think our balance of those policies and intentions are held in the ORCA based on a standards approach. So all projects, my first role at OHCS was developing, and for those of you who are in CFC time, was the needs analysis to do just that. So I kind of made that joke, knowing that in my own head, chuckling on the needs and what are the populations, where is the greatest amount of unmet need, and what are kind of deep diving into that. And I think we have at this moment in this market with this expansive need, there's need across all of the different populations, and so using set asides to try to make sure that we are prioritizing. There are resources that are specifically dedicated to particular populations. Again, I would say new investment in senior resources. So those are resources that will explicitly focus on older adults and persons with disabilities. We have resources specific to creating permanent supportive housing for chronic homeless. We have resources specific to veterans. And so I think we have resources specific to ag workers that Roberta was talking about earlier. And I think from at this point in time with this market and the reality that we have customized lanes of resources that can foster specific types of housing development, I think that's the perspective that we're holding. And I think, so at this point, I don't see it as a near term that we're going to do a big revision towards that. And I think on the cost metric, I think, in all ways and shapes, we are trying to ensure that projects are, that the projects we are investing in are efficiently built, are doing what they can to lessen cost of development. Again, as Mitch was talking about, interested and excited to see what we're learning from engaging in more modular development and more follow through on that, kind of look at where do we see, if we're looking, statistically across all of the things, do we see an area where there are those efficiencies? I think our challenge when we were really prioritizing in the NOFAs, the low cost development, is through production, as that project was moving forward, their costs were increasing. And that becomes challenging, if not impossible, to hold accountability to. And it is never a good day when you're telling a project that you gave a reservation to 9 months before, and their costs have increased and they need more subsidy. And if they propose their project as they had, that the project today, as if they had done that 9 months before, they wouldn't have been selected for funding. That is a no-winning conversation, right? Our effort there is to hold accountability on the competition instead of on development. And so I think that frame of mind and that shift feels pretty significantly important. We want to make sure that when we are selecting projects, it is for something that we can continue to hold accountability for. And so I can look at everybody in their eyes and say, yes, we treated everybody that same. And I think it was, every time one of those things would happen, needing to untangle that initial competition, whether it was a year before or 2 years ago, and candidly, sometimes 3 or 4 years before then in prior versions of our work. And so I think certainly wanting to make sure that we are building resources that are responsive and prioritizing needs in community. But I would expect we're doing more of those types of things from that subsidy side versus the competition and that focus of it. So if there were, legislative investment and choices to, again, the legislature has made lots of specific investments of resources for, to achieve a particular outcome or need. And so I think while the bulk of our resources really are being invested as lift resources, there are, again, like the modular is an example where they've also said, but it's also this project type that matters to us. And I think there's that ability to do that kind of flex and change.
Yeah, I think, just to reiterate the point Roberto made earlier, we do have priorities around rural Oregon, around culturally specific organizations and communities of color, and I think we are committed to continuing to develop in those communities and to push funding into those communities. And we're looking at all of the projects coming through the ORCA and doing constant evaluation to ensure that we're able to hit those targets. And if we're not, we're willing to adapt. And I think that's mentioning earlier the rural strategy and how we were feeling like we were actually funding projects in those areas, but continuing to gut check that and understanding, that we want to keep talking to you all to try to improve those processes and be able to fund projects in your communities that matter to your communities. But a lot of that is based on kind of the standards that we have in the ORCA now. It's not some explicit competitive process, but we do have a higher bar to ask folks to be talking to their community, the people that they'll be serving before they bring a project to us for approval. They have to have their resident services connected to actual conversations with the community and what they need. And they have to be able to draw those lines and connect in a way that they haven't in the past. And I think seeing, we're a year in, so we're starting to do that evaluation of these projects initially. And we'll adapt as we need to, because those are not priorities that have gone away. We're just trying to do it in a different way. We'll continue to adapt as we need to.
Mine? Yeah, I'll make it fast. You gave me a perfect segue there, actually. So as you're thinking about how you adapt over time and whether you're meeting those goals in rural communities or in non-metro urban communities, what sort of processes or cadence are you anticipating for review of that to ensure that you're meeting that and that investments that are made in those rural communities happen distributed across the state and not in one area, or non-metro urban communities are distributed in Medford and Bend and Salem instead of just one place, or housing types or other things?
Yeah, good question. So the cadence that we're currently working off of is as needed, which has been a little chaotic as we've sort of gotten through this initial year and seen things come up. We're working on trying to get to a space where we're updating the ORCA once a year, and we're able to do sort of an update to the standards as needed, to things like set-asides and subsidy limits and other things once a year, so that it's more predictable for you all and not something that's changing in a very rapid manner that you can't predict. We're hoping that we get to a space where that once-a-year update is not a major update, that we're able to sort of use the standards that we've had and maybe update the subsidy limits as necessary as costs increase or something along those lines. But we're hoping that it's not this every few months, as we are trying to get it to a place where it's more stable and it's more of a once-a-year thing. And we're already sort of working through our processes and expectations and timelines for that moving forward right now.
Great. Well, I know that we ran over maybe a couple minutes, but I'd like for everybody to please give a round of applause for our panelists. They did great. We are at the end of the session and at the end of the whole conference. So please, everybody, drive home safely, get home safely, and enjoy the rest of your work week if you have one. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. This is really helpful. Can I try again on this question, because I'm not involved in this project, but I'm here in the person who, and we do have a meeting with our TA tomorrow, so if it's like, if you're like, chill out, talk to your, but for Metro,